This is a spoken summary of Frank Dikötter's book, China After Mao, The Rise of a Superpower, published in 2022. The book traces the 4 decades between the death of Mao Zedong in 1976 and the consolidation of power by Xi Jinping around 2012, and it advances a single insistent argument. The celebrated era of reform and opening up, Dikötter contends, was neither a genuine economic miracle nor a real transition to a market economy, and political reform never accompanied economic change. What follows moves through the book in order, beginning with the author's preface, then each of the 10 chapters, and finally the epilogue. Preface. The author opens by setting his own history against China's transformation. He first went to China in the summer of 1985 as a student from the University of Geneva, assigned by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to Nankai University in Tianjin, a city then of 5 million people, a figure that has since trebled. He crossed from Hong Kong, a journey that took a week by train. There were only about 80 foreigners in all of Tianjin, among them 7 Dutch nationals, and, as he puts it, 1 Frank, and a postcard addressed simply to Frank from Holland, Tianjin, China, reached him without difficulty. In a nation of over 1 billion people, there were fewer than 20,000 private vehicles. Commuters cycled in designated lanes, and the city fell quiet by 9 in the evening. Returning for Nankai's centennial in October 2019, he found a transformed skyline, dominated by the Tianjin Finance Center, a tower almost 600 meters high, yet his former teachers still lived in the same shabby concrete blocks. The one change that mattered, he observes, was that the children of most professors were now in the United States. From this personal frame, Dikötter states his central thesis. There is, he argues, no economic freedom without political freedom. A market without the rule of law, an independent judiciary, and a free press is barely a market at all. Politics determines economics, not the other way around. The Communist Party never relinquished ownership of the means of production. Land, raw materials, the major industries, and the banks all remained in state hands, so the system stayed, in his account, fundamentally socialist. Foreign politicians and businessmen had long assumed that political reform would follow economic reform as surely as the cart follows the ox, but Dikötter insists no leader ever supported the separation of powers. Zhao Ziyang told the Party Congress in 1987, "We will never copy the separation of powers in the multi-party system of the West," and privately told Erich Honecker that once living standards rose, the party could gradually reduce the scope for liberalization. Xi Jinping repeated in 2018 that China must never copy other countries, least of all judicial independence or the separation of powers. When Shenzhen became the first special economic zone, Zhao insisted, "What we are setting up are special economic zones, not special political zones. We must uphold socialism and resist capitalism." Almost 40 years later, 95 of the top 100 private firms belong to current or former party members. Capital, Dikötter writes, is a political good, distributed by state banks for political ends. He dwells on how little is reliably known about China. Premier Li Keqiang once called the country's own output figures man-made and therefore unreliable, which gave rise to a so-called Li Keqiang index, based instead on electricity consumption. Quoting the journalist James Palmer, Dikötter notes that nobody knows anything about China, including the Chinese government, and adds his own sharper formulation, "Where China is concerned, we don't even know what we don't know." His account rests on roughly 600 documents drawn from a dozen municipal and provincial archives, open to historians after a 1996 law loosened access, together with newspaper reports, unpublished memoirs, and above all, the secret diaries of Li Rui, once Mao's personal secretary, a man imprisoned for 20 years for mentioning the Great Famine of 1959, later banned from publishing, whose diaries run to 2012, the year in which the study ends and in which Xi Jinping steps forward. Dikötter notes the paradox that the reform era became explorable precisely because the party assumed only a glorious story of a miracle could be found there. He then tests the common assumptions. Openness, he argues, is real only relative to the Cultural Revolution. The flows are state-controlled and often one-directional. After 40 years, China had fewer than 1 million resident foreigners, roughly 0.07% of the population, a lower share than North Korea's, and a fraction of Japan's. Each year, 1/5 of humanity could watch 36 state-sanctioned foreign films. He compares China's rulers to what one scholar called modern dictators, adaptable autocrats from Mozambique to Syria, who allowed markets while keeping power. The state grew rich while the people stayed frugal. Li Keqiang revealed in 2020 that some 600 million people lived on less than $140 a month, their savings sitting in state banks that funded skyscrapers, bullet trains, and state enterprises. About a fifth of the party's archival files, Dikötter reports, deal with debt, describing an economy of boom and endlessly postponed bust. The economist Sheng Songzuo remarked in 2019 that China's economy was built on speculation and was over-leveraged. There is, the author concludes, no grand plan and no secret strategy. China resembles a tanker that looks impressively shipshape from a distance, while, below deck, the crew frantically pump out water. Dikötter is candid about his sources and his limits. Democracies nominally follow a 30-year rule for releasing documents, and China's own law does the same, in principle opening files up to 1992, but in a dictatorship, its application is dictated locally, so that some archives are sealed, while others surprisingly yield material as recent as 2009. It was on such records that he had earlier built his People's Trilogy on ordinary lives under Mao, before the archives began closing again after Xi's rise. He also stresses the sheer inefficiency of the system he describes. Instead of orderly handovers of power, there was bitter backstabbing, leaders fixated on growth rather than development, and state enterprises that could actually subtract value, turning raw materials into finished goods worth less than the inputs. Even the one-child policy, he notes, produced consequences no one had planned, leaving men outnumbering women and a labor force destined to shrink. Chapter 1. From One Dictator to Another, 1976 to 1979. The central claim of the first chapter is that the transition after Mao's death was not a clean break toward reform, but a continuation of dictatorship under new managers. Both Hua Guofeng and Deng Xiaoping marched under the banner of Mao Zedong thought, and the reform agenda was largely a return to a Stalinist growth model conceived before the Cultural Revolution. Dikötter opens on Tiananmen Square in 1976, the world's largest paved expanse able to hold 1 million people. He recalls a longer history of protest and broken promise, the May 4th movement of 1919, when some 4,000 students demonstrated against the Treaty of Versailles in the name of Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy, the founding of Asia's first republic in 1912, and the party's own rhetoric, for in 1940, Mao and his ghostwriter Chen Boda had written on New Democracy, pledging a multi-party system, democratic freedoms, and private property, a program the author calls entirely fictitious since all of it was abandoned. The chapter turns on the death of Zhou Enlai in January 1976 and the mass mourning at the Qingming Festival on the 4th of April, when hundreds of thousands gathered in the square, partly to honor Zhou and partly to rebuke the radical Gang of Four led by Mao's wife, Jiang Qing. Zhou had promoted the four modernizations of agriculture, industry, national defense, and science and technology. Deng Xiaoping, brought back in 1974 as Zhou's deputy, had antagonized Jiang Qing and Mao's nephew, and Mao had turned instead to the loyal but minor figure of Hua Guofeng, once party secretary of Mao's birthplace, saying, "No one else tells the truth like Hua Guofeng." The protest was crushed by some 30,000 militia, armed, on Wang Hongwen's insistence, only with wooden truncheons. Over 200 people were beaten and arrested, while Jiang Qing watched through binoculars, and then, the author records, ate peanuts and roast pork. Deng was blamed and stripped of all his functions, except his party membership. The dying Mao, aged 82 and suffering from an undiagnosed motor neurone disease, elevated Hua as his designated successor, leaving a scrawled note, "With you in charge, I am at ease." Mao died just after midnight on the 9th of September 1976. Hua, who, as Minister of Public Security, had personally telephoned the order to attack the Tiananmen mourners, and so, in the author's phrase, had blood on his hands, moved quickly. On the 6th of October, under the pretext of discussing the 5th volume of Mao's selected works, the Gang of Four were arrested. A purge followed, which Dikötter calls a continuation, not a departure. Hua embalmed Mao, built his mausoleum, slicked back his hair in imitation of the chairman, and proclaimed the two whatevers. Whatever policies Mao had decided the party would defend, and whatever instructions he had issued it would obey. But Hua lacked charisma, and pressure from the elders Marshal Ye Jianying and Li Jianyan brought Deng back to power in the summer of 1977. Deng's program, the author insists, looked backward to 1956 and to Mao's own essay on the 10 major relationships, which had advocated borrowing science and technology from the capitalist countries, because, as Mao put it, they know how to do business. The growth model echoed Stalin: extract resources, sell abroad, and buy turnkey factories, the same strategy that had once been built on a Soviet famine. It produced a fresh and reckless import spree, with targets leaping from $6.5 billion toward $80 billion, and more than 20 turnkey factories imported in 1978 alone, even as the State Council admitted that in some provinces, 1 in 3 cadres was illiterate. Central to the chapter is what Dikötter calls a great misunderstanding on both sides. Chinese fact-finding delegations toured Mobil, Exxon, John Deere, and Disneyland and reported back that the United States was a power in terminal decline, an opportunity to be seized. Milton Friedman, visiting in 1980, found the experts unbelievably ignorant of how a market works. Foreign statesmen made the mirror image error, with figures such as Zbigniew Brzezinski and Senator Henry Jackson believing that a prosperous China would inevitably become a democracy, which the author calls the other great geopolitical misunderstanding of the 20th century. Deng, meanwhile, exploited popular feeling through the democracy wall at Zaidan, where activists demanded the rehabilitation of purged leaders and universal suffrage, and where the young electrician Wei Jingsheng demanded a fifth modernization, democracy itself. Deng told the American journalist Robert Novak, "The democracy wall is a fine thing, at least while it served his purpose of finally displacing Hua Guofeng, who lowered his own flag in late 1978. Then, in early 1979, after ordering an invasion of Vietnam that he had promised in Washington would teach Vietnam a lesson, and that turned into a costly debacle when some 200,000 troops crossed the border, Deng turned on the movement. Human rights were branded a capitalist concept. Wei Jingsheng, who had dared to ask whether Deng was becoming a new autocrat, was arrested, and the wall was shut down." The chapter also traces the ideological maneuvering that let Deng displace Hua. Through 1978, a proxy war was fought between Wang Dongxing, defending the two whatevers on Hua's behalf, and Hu Yaobang, head of the Central Party School, who promoted the slogan that practice was the sole criterion of truth. Hu won, and the December 1978 plenum became the pivot on which Deng turned. Hua's own economic program, meanwhile, had amounted to a new great leap in miniature, with grandiose targets set at more than 40 economic meetings and a pledge to build a powerful modern socialist country by the end of the century. On the world stage, Deng courted Japan, which had become China's most generous donor, and normalized relations with the United States, charming American audiences, and, on a celebrated visit, donning a cowboy hat at a Texas rodeo, before winning Most Favored Nation trading status that took effect in 1980. Chapter 2. Retrenchment 1979 to 1982. The second chapter argues that this period was dominated not by Deng, but by the conservative planner Chen Yun and a group of party elders who imposed a policy of readjustment, or retrenchment, to rein in the reckless spending. Chen Yun, the author explains, came best out of the December 1978 plenum, so that Deng was weakened at the very moment of his apparent ascendancy. Chen was a genuine proletarian, once a typesetter at the commercial press in Shanghai, who had studied Soviet economics and drawn up China's first economic plan and its grain monopoly. He favored what he called a birdcage approach. The market was the bird and the plan the cage, and the bird must not be allowed to fly away. Mao had once called him a man who could not get rid of his bourgeois character. Chen pointed to a gaping budget hole, with state income of 112 billion yuan against projected outgoings of 124 billion and unfinished projects requiring 6 or 7 times the available funds. Deng, no economic expert, acquiesced in cutting imports and lowering targets for 3 years, yet the plan barely functioned. And this is the chapter's deeper point. Dikötter argues that China did not truly have a planned economy because it lacked the statisticians to run one. Its Bureau for Statistics had only 200 staff at the height of the Cultural Revolution against 220,000 in the Soviet Union. Subverting the master plan was, in the historian Robert Service's phrase, the oil that prevented the system from grinding to a complete standstill. Once local governments were allowed to keep a share of profits while passing deficits to the central bank, every locality wanted its own factories. The number of county distilleries jumped from around 1,500 to 12,000 in a single year, and a third of new projects nationwide lacked electricity. Investment ran out of control, doubling and then trebling in the provinces, and while official inflation was reported at around 6%, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank put the real combined figure at close to 38%. The author dwells on the Baoshan Iron and Steel Works near Shanghai as an emblem of the whole enterprise. Steel was, he writes, the sacred ingredient in the alchemy of socialism, yet the plant was built on soft riverbank ground, depended on ore shipped from Australia and Brazil, and was blocked by a sandbank that bulk carriers could not cross. To finance such projects, China issued bonds for the first time in 30 years. Dikötter also describes a hidden currency trick, a secret internal settlement rate introduced in 1981 to make exports profitable, kept secret because to reveal it would be to admit the country had two currencies. The real growth, the author insists, came from below, in a silent rural revolution. Even before Mao died, villagers had begun reclaiming and quietly dividing collective land, sometimes with officials distributing it, sometimes with officials looking away. Procurement prices had been set some 20% below the cost of production, and grain reserves in provinces such as Hunan and Henan had been largely consumed, so that China had to import wheat from Canada and Australia. The party formally forbade family farming. The 1978 plenum declared, "We do not allow family farming, we do not allow the division of land, and we do not allow individuals to strike out on their own." But the tide could not be held. By early 1981, 78% of households in Guizhou, 56% in Gansu, and 51% in Anhui were tilling land themselves. As one farmer put it, "The collectives are unreliable, so we have no alternative but to parcel out the land." Deng conceded ground, remarking that it could hardly influence the socialist nature of the system, and the people's communes were dissolved in the winter of 1982, by which time rural incomes had doubled. One scholar concluded that a sea of unorganized farmers had already made the communes irrelevant. But the freedoms were partial, and the state's grip persisted. Families received only 15-year leases, never ownership, and the household registration system, introduced by Zhou Enlai in 1955, tied villagers to the land and divided city dwellers from peasants as a hereditary caste, leaving roughly 100 million people surplus or underemployed. Agriculture was starved of investment, as one leader admitted there was no money for it, and education was neglected in favor of prestige projects, so that in one county in Zhejiang, 70% of young people could not read. Alongside this ran the coercive one-child policy, rooted in Mao's own remark that humanity was incapable of managing its own reproduction. Drastic measures came from 1981, with Chen Yun declaring that 1 billion people could not eat too much, and a rocket scientist turned demographer, providing a pseudo-scientific justification of a population time bomb. In one commune in Guangdong, 316 of 325 pregnancies were terminated. The numbers peaked in 1983 with more than 14 million abortions and over 20 million sterilizations. Birth control, Dikötter writes, in effect meant life control. The chapter also recounts the televised show trial of the Gang of Four before 880 representatives of the masses, and the 1981 resolution on party history, drafted with the involvement of some 6,000 people, which allowed the party to absolve Mao himself. As Deng insisted, to blacken Mao would be to blacken the party. There would be no de-Maoification, and the December 1978 plenum was consecrated as the great turning point in history. Beneath the failing plan, a second economy was quietly taking shape. Collective township and village enterprises, nominally public but often privately run, spread fastest in Guangdong's Pearl River Delta, where the reform-minded First Secretary Ren Zhongyi let the province follow the market. In one county, a 2,000-worker sofa factory sprang up, and a tenth of the fields were turned over to flowers. Along the coast, smuggling flourished on a spectacular scale, with the State Council reporting that more than 1 million televisions and calculators had been trafficked, and one town opposite Taiwan hosting 20,000 people trading contraband every day. Foreign trade itself ran at a loss under the official exchange rate, since goods that earned $1 abroad cost far more than $1 to produce, which was precisely why the secret internal settlement rate had to be devised. The paradox of the period, Dikötter argues, was that the state's retreat in the countryside, forced upon it from below, was the one policy that actually worked. Chapter 3. Reform, 1982 to 1984. The third chapter's argument is captured in Deng's own image of cleaning the house before inviting guests. Before accelerating socialist modernization and opening further to the world, the leadership combined crackdowns on crime and foreign influence with the extension of the rural contract system to industry and foreign trade. At the 12th Party Congress in September 1982, Deng warned, "We shall never permit the bourgeois way of life to spread in our country." The regime revived the model soldier Lei Feng, whom Mao had once urged the nation to emulate, and declared the 5th of March Lei Feng Day. It produced new martyrs, among them a medical student who died in a manure pit trying to save an old farmer, praised by the leadership as the pride and glory of the party, though such stories also drew public ridicule. When the editor Wang Ruoshui and the former propaganda chief Zhou Yang wrote about Marxist humanism and alienation, arguing that socialism too could alienate people, they were attacked by hardliners for bourgeois liberalization, and Wang was forced into self-criticism. Two campaigns followed. An anti-corruption drive convicted some 30,000 party members of economic crimes. By the summer of 1983, a few shot on television. Then came a strike hard campaign against common criminals, in which around 3,000 people were arrested in Beijing in a single night, and a crowd of 60,000 at the Workers' Stadium cheered as 30 convicts were sentenced to death. In October 1983, Deng launched a campaign against spiritual pollution, calling writers, in Stalin's phrase, engineers of the human soul. It purged libraries and banned foreign films and pop music, but was wound down within months when it began to reveal open disillusionment with socialism, one railway worker saying he believed in money, not in communism. Economically, the chapter describes the extension of the contract responsibility system to the cities under the slogan "To get rich is glorious," which replaced the iron rice bowl of guaranteed employment with what officials called a porcelain one. Deng quadrupled the growth target Zhou Enlai had once set for the end of the century, settling on 7% a year. The People's Bank and 4 specialized banks raised their loan limits. The money supply surged by 40 to 50%, and inflation reached 23% in 1984. Growth, Dikötter argues, came from throwing in ever more capital and labor, rather than from rising productivity. As one official told Eric Honecker, "We consume more than we produce." The waste was staggering, with billions of yuan of shoddy, unsellable goods piling up in storage, and an accounting method inherited from the Soviet Union that counted volume rather than value, so that in 1 year the mills produced 50 million tons of steel, of which only 5 million were usable. Private traders, the Gedihu, re-emerged, and Wenzhou became what the author calls the hotbed of capitalism, yet the leadership warned that if such enterprise spread province-wide, China would no longer be a socialist country, and by 1987, only 22 million private employees were registered, among a population of more than 1 billion. One economist called the result a confused economic system. The chapter also recounts Deng's surprise visit to Shenzhen in January 1984, after which he pronounced the policy of special economic zones correct. The model was neighboring Hong Kong, with its 36,000 factories, rather than Japan. Shenzhen had been a settlement of 30,000 villagers in 1976, and now drew crowds of visitors, though it imported 3 times what it exported, and the state poured in about $1 billion a year. In April 1984, 14 coastal cities were opened, and Zhao Ziyang, who made Alvin Toffler's book The Third Wave mandatory reading, told officials not to come running to Beijing with every problem. Counterfeiting was actively encouraged, with a 1983 directive on maintaining secrecy while copying foreign pharmaceutical products, and Shanghai plotted to clone the IBM 370 computer by way of its sister city, San Francisco. The chapter ends with the Sino-British Joint Declaration of December 1984, which set Hong Kong's return for the 1st of July 1997 with a 50-year guarantee, and with the memory of Margaret Thatcher stumbling on the steps of the Great Hall of the People after her earlier meeting with Deng. The credit boom of these years bred improvisation that verged on fraud. A pyramid of interbank lending grew up, with dozens of trust companies passing money between provinces, and a principle that local officials commanded local banks. What the author likens to a leader principle meant factories were built and loans extended on political order rather than commercial sense. Some managers simply refused to honor their debts. Foreign trade produced its own scandals, the largest being the Hainan affair, in which tens of thousands of duty-free cars were imported to the island and resold on the mainland at a vast profit, which Dikötter calls the biggest foreign currency manipulation in the country's history. The dual exchange rate introduced in 1980 was abandoned at the start of 1985, and the currency was steadily devalued thereafter, even as exports climbed from under $10 billion in 1978 toward $50 billion by 1988. Chapter 4 of People and Prices, 1984 to 1988. The fourth chapter interweaves the political fall of the reformist General Secretary Hu Yaobang with the mounting disorder of what was called the price problem. Dikötter portrays Hu, a small and energetic Hunanese, as an incautious figure whose missteps accumulated. He let members of the Writers' Association vote freely so that critics rather than hardliners prevailed, which Li Jiannian called a rebellion against the party. He gave a candid interview to a Hong Kong journalist that Deng found completely unacceptable, and he agreed too readily when Deng floated the idea of retirement, another faux pas. Meanwhile, student protests spread. In late 1985, students demonstrated against Japan, and in late 1986, at the University of Science and Technology in Hefei, the astrophysicist Fang Lizhi backed students who quoted Lincoln's call for government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Protests spread to a dozen cities, and in Shanghai, 100,000 filled People's Square. Deng's response was blunt. We cannot copy bourgeois democracy, and we should not only talk about using dictatorial means, we should be ready actually to use them. He praised Poland's imposition of martial law. Hu was forced to resign in January 1987, denounced over 6 days, the most damning charge being that he had divulged state secrets. At the 13th Party Congress that year, Deng, aged 83, formally retired but retained the final say and the chairmanship of the military commission, becoming, in the author's phrase, a dictator without a title, while other aged elders kept the right to sit in on the leadership's meetings. The economic heart of the chapter is the dual-track price system, under which the same goods carry both a low plan price and a higher market price, creating what Dikötter calls a huge gray zone of corruption. Local governments took over price setting and protected their own enterprises, selling local coal cheaply to insiders and dearly to outsiders, and this provoked what the author calls trade wars, a cocoon war over silk, conflicts over coal, wool, and tobacco. A lorry of grapes traveling to Fujian passed more than 100 checkpoints and lost its entire cargo. Total credit tripled between 1982 and 1986, little of it repaid, in a vicious circle of money supply, feeding consumption, feeding inflation, feeding still more loans, the principal architect of which, Dikötter writes, was Zhao Ziyang. By the first half of 1987, 4 in 10 urban households saw real incomes fall, and rationing of pork and sugar returned. Inflation officially reached 30% by August 1988, though the planner Yao Yilin privately estimated 48% for the first half of the year. Deng pushed for sweeping price decontrol, declaring, "We don't fear big waves," and demanding that the obstacle to price reform be smashed. At the Seaside Leadership Retreat, the Premier Li Peng, a Soviet-trained engineer and Zhou Enlai's adopted son, led the opposition alongside Chen Yun. Deng slammed the table and told him, "If you waver, you can quit." But when a People's Daily editorial in August 1988 signaled that reform was coming, the result was disaster. Bank runs, with tens of millions of dollars withdrawn in Shanghai in 2 weeks, unrest in Zhejiang, and panic hoarding of salt. Within days, the price reform was scrapped, and Deng, in the author's words, flinched. Chen Yun's planners regained control, imposing another round of retrenchment, and in the countryside, farmers were increasingly paid in worthless IOUs rather than cash, so that the Bank of Agriculture was effectively bankrupt. Zhao Ziyang said he would rather print more money than issue IOUs. By early 1989, some 50 million rural people were on the road. The chapter also notes the 6-part television documentary River Elegy, which contrasted the silt-laden, stagnant yellow river of the Chinese past with the blue ocean of the Western future, and sold over 1 million copies of its script before being banned, and a rising tide of xenophobic incidents, including riots against African students. It closes on the ominous note that, as the year of the snake approached, heightened vigilance was required. The disorder reached deep into the villages. A grain contract system introduced in 1985, combined with input prices that rose by a quarter, cut the harvest and left farmers holding promissory notes instead of cash, so that in some counties, half of all rural deposits were mere IOUs. Zhao Ziyang, who had once boasted that reform would create a miracle, now said he would rather print money than issue such notes. The political mood hardened in step with the economic one. During an earlier crime crackdown, Deng had ordered officials to kill a few and produce a shock, and to be ruthless for 2 years, and more than 1 million people were sent to prison. It was in Shanghai, during the student unrest of 1986, that the local party secretary Jiang Zemin was hooted off the stage at Jiaotong University, an episode that did nothing to slow his rise. Chapter 5. The Massacre, 1989. The fifth chapter narrates the movement of 1989, from Hu Yaobang's death to the crackdown of the 4th of June. Dikötter argues that the protests grew out of accumulated grievance over inflation and corruption as much as democratic aspiration, that a split leadership dithered until Deng imposed martial law, and that the army, having twice been repelled by unarmed citizens, ultimately unleashed massive military force on the people of Beijing. He sets the scene in a city still drab but visibly changed since Mao, with colorful clothes, imported cars, and new hotels, yet home also to tens of millions of rightless rural migrants, a hereditary caste locked into poverty. Earlier that spring, Fang Lizhi had written an open letter to Deng calling for the release of political prisoners, and had observed that 40 years of socialism had left people despondent. President George Bush, once head of the American Liaison Office in Beijing, invited Fang to a banquet, only for the police to block him from attending. Hu Yaobang died of a heart attack on the 15th of April, and students converged on Tiananmen. A poster at Peking University read that the democratic spirit had died with him. On the 26th of April, a People's Daily editorial, reflecting Deng's private judgment that this was not an ordinary student movement, but turmoil, branded the protests a planned conspiracy by a small number of people with ulterior motives. It backfired, and 150,000 marched the next day, workers joining the students. The hunger strike began on the 13th of May, 2 days before a summit with Mikhail Gorbachev, the student leader Chai Ling declaring, "We, the children, are ready to die." By Gorbachev's arrival, over 300,000 filled the square, and the rock musician Kui Zhan sang "Nothing to My Name." The leadership split in public. Zhao Ziyang told Gorbachev that Deng still made all the major decisions, revealing the secret party resolution of 1987, and the hardliners fixed on this, and on Zhao's earlier sympathetic speeches, as the turning point. At Deng's residence on the 17th of May, martial law was decided, and Zhao said, "My time is up." At dawn on the 19th, a tearful Zhao appeared on the square and told the students through a megaphone, "We have come too late." It was his last public appearance. Just after midnight, Li Peng proclaimed martial law on television. When the troops first tried to enter the city, citizens poured out to surround the convoys, blocking them with lorries and offering the soldiers food and water, and Li Peng admitted the leadership had not expected such huge resistance. The army withdrew on the 22nd of May. Protests spread nationwide, and in Hong Kong, a benefit concert drew 200,000, while 1.5 million marched under the banner, "Today China, Tomorrow Hong Kong." By late May, over 100,000 soldiers from 11 army groups had massed, and on the 30th, the students unveiled a 10-meter statue, the goddess of democracy. The killing began on the night of the 3rd of June. First shots were fired around 11:15 at Gangzufen by the 38th Army, whose commander had refused to lead his troops and had been arrested for it. Soldiers fired on crowds and into residential buildings along the western approaches at Muxidi. In the very block where the diarist Li Rui lived, a bullet killed a prosecutor's son-in-law and left about 100 bullet holes. Around 3,000 students remained at the Monument to the People's Heroes, singing the Internationale, until the writer Liu Xiaobo negotiated their safe passage, and they filed out at about 5 in the morning as a tank crushed the goddess of democracy. A late-arriving army group then fired indiscriminately along Chang'an Avenue, a platoon gunning down some 40 people in view of the journalists at the Beijing Hotel. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and corpses were laid on ice. Estimates of the dead varied. An American network correspondent counted around 2,600, and the British ambassador estimated between 2,700 and 3,400. One foreign military attaché judged that the army had shown total military incompetence and a complete inability to exploit the chances of an almost bloodless victory. On the 5th of June, a lone man halted a column of tanks, producing what Dikötter calls one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. Dikötter is careful to show how avoidable the bloodshed was. When the leadership offered a televised dialogue, its spokesman insisted that press censorship did not exist in the country, a claim that only deepened the students' anger. On the day before the killing, some 8,000 unarmed young soldiers had again been turned back near the Beijing hotel, and it was only after crowds seized weapons at one intersection that the leadership declared a counter-revolutionary riot and ordered the square cleared by dawn. The split at the top ran to the last. The intelligence chief put security on alert, the reformers pleaded for the incendiary editorial to be withdrawn, and the hardliners prevailed only by invoking Zhao Ziyang's conciliatory speeches as proof of betrayal. The retribution afterward was as revealing as the violence. The regime that had sent tanks against its own citizens then staged the Asian Games the following year, winning the lion's share of the medals, while quietly demolishing the homes of some 2,000 families to make room, a juxtaposition the author lets speak for itself. Chapter 6. Watershed, 1989 to 1991. The sixth chapter argues that the 4th of June was a genuine watershed, after which the party abandoned the more conciliatory approach of the 1980s in favor of repression, ideological rearmament, and survival through export-led growth, even under sanctions. The regime inverted the story of the massacre, portraying the soldiers as the victims. The spokesman Yuan Mu announced a shocking counter-revolutionary rebellion and put the death toll at about 300, most of them supposedly military, and television showed wounded soldiers and carbonized bodies. On the 8th of June, Li Peng, in a Mao jacket, praised the troops. "You have worked hard, comrades." Protests flared in other cities, in Chengdu, Xi'an, and Lanzhou, where crowds sealed the railway station for 5 days. In Shanghai, the mayor Zhu Rongji appealed for calm, ruling out martial law and asking, "Do you want chaos in Shanghai?" International reaction was sharp, but in Dikötter's account, ultimately hollow. Margaret Thatcher was appalled, and Helmut Kohl condemned the barbaric use of brutal violence, but President George Bush was muted, saying he did not think the whole People's Liberation Army should be judged by that terrible incident, calling Deng forward-looking, and within weeks sending Brent Scowcroft on a secret mission to assure Deng that President Bush was a true friend. Deng was blunt in reply, telling the Americans it was for Washington to untie the knot. The lesson the regime drew, the author argues, was that it could safely ignore Washington's public statements. At home came mass arrests through informant hotlines, arrest warrants for 21 student leaders, and summary executions, a bullet in the back of the head. Ordinary workers bore the brunt. One man jailed for 13 years over the theft of what was called an expensive chicken. An operation codenamed Yellow Bird smuggled prominent activists out through Hong Kong. Fearful above all of the Polish example of an independent trade union, the party crushed the Beijing Workers' Autonomous Union and repressed underground Catholic and Protestant churches, the repression fiercest on the fringes. In Xinjiang and Tibet, ideological rearmament followed. Zhao Ziyang was voted out and replaced as general secretary by Jiang Zemin, the Shanghai party boss, an electrical engineer trained at the Stalin Automobile Works in Moscow. A party document named the true danger as peaceful evolution, the idea, drawn from a Cold War speech by the American Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, that the West sought to subvert socialism from within. An anti-pornography crusade pulped tens of millions of publications. Lei Feng was revived once more, and the party designated a national humiliation day tied to the Treaty of Nanjing and the Opium War. Then European communism collapsed. The Solidarity movement triumphed in Poland, the Berlin Wall fell, and Ceausescu, who alone attempted a Chinese-style solution, was toppled and shot. The failed coup against Gorbachev in August 1991 gave way to Yeltsin on the tank, and the Soviet flag came down on Christmas Day 1991. The elder Bo Yibo declared, "Only China can save socialism." Economically, the price of Tiananmen was steep. The G7 in Paris postponed loans, Japan suspended billions, foreign debt reached $42 billion, and growth fell to under 4%. The regime devalued the currency twice, wrestled with a triangular debt among enterprises that reached the equivalent of some $55 billion, and ransomed the dissident Fang Liji in exchange for the resumption of World Bank lending. Deng's guiding maxim for these lean years, the author records, was to hide one's capabilities and bide one's time, for he who takes the lead will lose the initiative. The reordering at the top was swift and telling. At a plenum that lasted barely an hour, secret ballots were abandoned, and Zhao Ziang was voted out by a show of hands, his aide Bao Tong later jailed for 7 years. Jiang Zemin, promoted over the heads of others, set about learning the role. In Hong Kong, the Basic Law ratified in 1990 was rigged against direct elections and carried a national security clause, Article 23, that the author calls tinder for future unrest. Economically, the recovery leaned on outside money even as Western governments postponed loans. Taiwan quietly became the largest single source of foreign investment, and Zhu Rongji, elevated to vice premier in 1991, threw 50 billion yuan at the triangular debt clogging the state sector. The regime had discovered that it could weather condemnation, monetize its prisoners through what amounted to hostage diplomacy, and lean on nationalism to shore up its legitimacy. Chapter 7. Capitalist Tools in Socialist Hands, 1992 to 1996. The 7th chapter takes its argument directly from its title. Deng Xiaoping's southern tour of early 1992 broke the post-Tiananmen deadlock and unleashed an investment boom, but reform meant using capitalist tools while keeping them firmly in socialist hands. On the 19th of January 1992, Deng, then formally retired, visited Shenzhen, touring an amusement park in a golf cart, and declared, "Reform and opening up is China's only option, and whoever is opposed to reform should leave office." His reassurance to the party was that there was nothing to fear from foreign investment, because the publicly owned sector remained the mainstay and political power was in the party's hands. The state media at first blacked out his remarks, which leaked through Hong Kong, but Jiang Zemin quickly trimmed his sails and offered self-criticism. Investment then surged, with development zones multiplying from about 117 to over 8,700 by the end of 1992, most without central approval. Zhu Rongji estimated that to develop them all would cost at least 4.5 trillion yuan. Milton Friedman toured the new Pudong district of Shanghai and dismissed it as a Potemkin village built for a reigning emperor. Stock exchanges had opened in Shenzhen and Shanghai, and companies began to list in Hong Kong, though much of the so-called foreign investment was in fact domestic capital routed out and back through Hong Kong shell companies. By some estimates, 2/3 of it. The boom brought inflation that shoppers reckoned at 30 or 40%, and it left the 900 million villagers behind, paid in promissory notes for their grain while migrant workers earned $2 to $4 a day. Dikötter's central point is that the system contained a fatal contradiction. The local banks, he writes, followed orders from the local party secretary, obeying neither the discipline of the market nor that of the plan. One banker sighed that what the country needed was an enlightened Mao. Zhu Rongji imposed austerity from 1993, foreclosed on more than 1,000 zones, took personal control of the People's Bank, and on the 1st of January 1994 unified the exchange rate at 8.7 yuan to the dollar, a devaluation of 1/3, and separated national from local taxes, moves that turned a trade deficit into a surplus and lifted reserves toward $78 billion. Meanwhile, Jiang Zemin consolidated power, purging the Yang brothers who had overplayed their hand, reshuffling more than 1,000 military leaders, and using an anti-corruption drive to impose central authority, bringing down the Beijing party secretary Chen Zhitong, later sentenced to 16 years after his deputy shot himself. Jiang promoted a campaign for spiritual civilization, holding up a model city as an Orwellian paradise, stripping foreign names from more than 20,000 companies and hundreds of streets, and targeting McDonald's and Mickey Mouse. He also elevated the theorist Wang Huning, author of a book titled America Against America. The chapter covers the Taiwan Strait crisis of 1995 and 1996, when missile tests around Taiwan's first direct presidential election prompted President Clinton to send 2 aircraft carriers, and Beijing's moves in the South China Sea, seizing reefs and passing sovereignty legislation. It closes with the death of Deng Xiaoping in February 1997, aged 92, met, the author observes, with widespread indifference, itself a measure of Deng's success in achieving the peaceful transfer of power he had sought. The frenzy after the Southern tour had a speculative edge. Pudong was billed as China's new Hong Kong. A new company was said to be forming every 11 minutes, and on the island of Hainan, property prices spiked and then collapsed, leaving billions in bad debt. Capital markets were built to absorb the enthusiasm, with special shares for foreigners at home and listings in Hong Kong abroad, Tsingtao Beer becoming the first mainland firm to list there. The old maladies persisted underneath. Automobile output passed 1 million vehicles, but the state sector bled money. More than 10,000 incidents of industrial unrest were recorded in a single year, and the relatives of party leaders occupied thousands of the best jobs. Against this, Jiang held up model cities of enforced order and launched a campaign for spiritual civilization, even as he prepared the ground for the harder line to come. Chapter 8. Big is Beautiful, 1997 to 2001. The 8th chapter argues that the Asian financial crisis forced the regime into a choice of reform or ruin, but that its chosen path meant more state intervention, not less. Under Jiang Zemin's slogan, "Grasp the big and let go of the small," hand-picked state enterprises were consolidated into giant conglomerates, or national champions, and minority stakes were listed abroad, while the state kept control. The chapter opens with the Hong Kong handover on the 30th of June 1997. As the Union flag came down, Chris Patten wept in the drizzle, and more than 4,000 troops crossed the border at dawn. A new Provisional Legislative Council promptly reversed Patten's electoral reforms and narrowed the franchise. China was largely insulated from the crisis that swept Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea, because its currency was not convertible and its markets were closed to foreigners, and the central bank spent about $100 million a day to hold the yuan steady. But the country was awash in overcapacity, its warehouses holding 16 million unsold televisions, 20 million bicycles, and more than 1 billion shirts, and it entered the longest deflation in its modern history, lasting some 29 months. State industry was effectively insolvent, with debt ratios above 80% and bad loans that Dikötter puts closer to 40% than the official quarter. When China Telecom listed in Hong Kong and New York in 1997, raising $4.5 billion and the world's 5th largest telecom offering, underwritten by Goldman Sachs, the author calls it the perfect example of capitalist tools in socialist hands, since the ministry could still elect the entire board of directors. By 2001, firms such as PetroChina, Sinopec, and China Unicom had listed in New York and more than 50 in Hong Kong. Jiang and Zhu Rongji insisted repeatedly that this was not privatization. The term used, Dikötter notes, was change of ownership, and when Zhu explained as much to George Bush, the former president replied, "We know what is going on." The human cost was mass unemployment, with some 13 million state workers dismissed and total layoffs estimated at 20 to 30 million, whole industrial districts in the Northeast falling idle. In the countryside, predatory local fees consumed perhaps 1/4 to 2/5 of peasant incomes. Near one city, officials levied 57 kinds of fee, most of them illegal. The private sector was for the first time genuinely welcomed, upgraded in a 1999 constitutional amendment from a complement to an important component of the economy, yet it still employed only a small fraction of urban workers. Politically, the party crushed the fledgling China Democracy Party, whose organizers were arrested even as China signed, but never ratified, an international covenant on civil and political rights, and it moved against the Falun Gong spiritual movement, which had stunned the leadership by quietly surrounding the Zhongnanhai compound with about 10,000 followers in April 1999. Jiang declared that stability had fallen through, banned the movement, and detained tens of thousands. The decisive event of the chapter is the NATO bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in May 1999, which killed 3 Chinese journalists and triggered anti-American riots. The Beijing embassy pelted and a consulate set alight. Jiang told his colleagues that the Americans, deep in their bones, hated China to death, and that the country must strengthen its preparations for a military conflict, while publicly returning to Deng's counsel to keep a low profile and bide one's time. Within weeks, the Foreign Ministry was again urging Washington to press on with China's entry to the World Trade Organization. The chapter also introduces the doctrine of the Three Represents, ghostwritten by Wang Huning and launched in 2000, which ended the ban on party membership for private business people, while, in the author's reading, being designed to extend the hand of the state rather than retract it, by planting party cells inside private firms. As one red capitalist in Wenzhou put it, in the end, it all belongs to the party. The banking system was, in Dikotter's account, technically insolvent. The old investment trust collapsed, the largest in Guangdong, liquidated in 1998, owing more than $2.5 billion, and Zhu Rongji had to recapitalize the four big state banks with 270 billion yuan and hive off their bad loans into so-called asset management companies whose reckoning was simply postponed. The human ledger was grim. Rural credit unions ran deep into the red, small coal mines killed thousands of miners a year, and whole village enterprise sectors that had once employed tens of millions began to shed workers. When President Clinton visited in 1998 and declared that democracy would come to China, the regime exiled its best-known dissidents and, on the very day he arrived, arrested the activists who tried to register an opposition party. China signed an international covenant on civil and political rights and then never ratified it, a pattern the author reads as characteristic. Chapter 9. Going Global, 2001 to 2008. The ninth chapter argues that China's accession to the World Trade Organization in December 2001 did not, as Western economists and democracy advocates had predicted, drive market liberalization, the rule of law, or political reform. Instead, the state harnessed membership to supercharge a subsidized, export-driven, resource-hungry growth machine that entrenched party control. China's economic condition at the time was dire. State enterprises ran in the red, deflation had returned, and one accounting firm estimated bad loans at 44% of all lending, close to half of annual output. Zhu Rongji promised that admission would accelerate reform by exposing the state sector to competition, and a vice minister of finance predicted membership would work like a wrecking ball, smashing whatever was left of the old planned economy. Yet China joined without floating its currency, making its capital account convertible, or reforming its state enterprises. Optimists abroad were euphoric. One economist calculated a rise in American exports. The general mood was summed up as, "They give, we take." What's not to like? And it was called a no-brainer, while one scholar predicted China would become a democracy around the year 2015. The results, in Dikotter's telling, confounded these hopes. Within a year, the American trade surplus with China ran at about $11 billion a month, and by 2008, it exceeded $266 billion. Mexico's deficit rose tenfold as more than 500 foreign-owned factories moved from there to China within 2 years. China exported deflation across the world, driving the American Consumer Price Index into a year-on-year fall unmatched since the Great Depression, and it cloned foreign products with impunity, becoming, in the words the author quotes, the world's #1 counterfeiter, with losses to foreign firms estimated at $60 billion by 2004. Fake goods carried a human cost at home. Melamine-adulterated infant formula sickened a reported 300,000 babies. The scandal covered up for months, and 140,000 people died in work-related accidents in a single year, with child labor relatively common in some regions. The state kept its hand on every lever, holding the currency down by buying U.S. treasuries until reserves passed $1 trillion, and rebating export taxes at a cost of up to a third of central spending. As one finance official said, if the rules say we cannot do it this way, we simply change the methods. The going global, or go out strategy, sent Chinese firms hunting for resources across Africa and Latin America, offering loans under a doctrine of non-interference welcomed by governments in Sudan and Zimbabwe, so that within a few years, China had oil operations in some 20 African countries, and Brazil was shipping more soy to China than to the United States. China, the author writes, had sucked the cupboard bare of raw materials. A parallel Go West campaign developed Xinjiang, where Han settlers had risen from 3 to 40% of the population and drove a 4,000-kilometer gas pipeline to Shanghai. A vast construction frenzy absorbed roughly half the world's cement, a third of its steel, and a quarter of its copper. In the showcase city of Chongqing, an official boasted of spending more than $1 billion a month. Genuine reform, meanwhile, ended. Proposals to sell stakes in banks and securities firms to foreigners were rejected as threats to financial security, and by 2004, State-owned businesses held 96% of the assets of the 500 largest companies, while opening up gave way to the slogan of a harmonious society. Pollution mounted, with 300 million rural people drinking tainted water and the environmental agency staffed at a fraction of its American counterpart, and mass incidents multiplied into the tens of thousands each year. The chapter culminates in the Beijing Olympics of 2008, a showcase built on a covered-up SARS epidemic exposed by a whistleblowing doctor, some $40 billion of spending, mass evictions, a lip-synced anthem, and computer-generated fireworks, and it ends with the author's pointed verdict that less openness, not more, was clearly the key to success. The copy culture was pervasive enough, Dikötter argues, to make original research economically pointless. Blockbuster films appeared on disc before their American release, some 100 fake Harry Potter titles circulated, and at the 2003 Shanghai Auto Show, a domestic car maker displayed a near clone of a General Motors van at two-thirds the price. Factories drained away from higher-cost countries, with hundreds moving from Mexico to China within 2 years, and by 2003, roughly 70% of the goods on Walmart shelves were sourced in China. The workers who made them had few protections, one man losing 2 fingers, and remarking that if you let your mind wander for a second, it was over. Beneath the boom lay the covered-up SARS epidemic of 2003, exposed by a whistleblowing military doctor, and the Tibetan unrest of 2008, both of which the leadership treated first as problems of information control rather than of substance. Chapter 10. Hubris, 2008 to 2012. The 10th chapter argues that the global financial crisis, which crippled the West, but which China survived through a colossal debt-fueled stimulus, bred hubris in Beijing. When Lehman Brothers, founded in 1847 and carrying more than $600 billion of debt, collapsed in September 2008, the export-dependent Chinese economy was hit hard, and tens of thousands of factories closed. Profits in Wenzhou were cut by half, and then more, when Jiabao answered with a stimulus of some $586 billion, equal to 14% of output, more than double the American share, prompting an HSBC economist to remark that they were going to spend like there was no tomorrow. The money poured into railways and a construction boom so vast that China used more cement in 3 years than the United States had used in the entire 20th century, building bullet trains, hundreds of new museums, and skyscrapers. But much of it was wasted on demolition and shoddy tofu buildings, and when the Sichuan earthquake struck in 2008 and killed 87,000 people, more than 7,000 school buildings collapsed from substandard construction. New bank lending in 2009 alone reached the equivalent of more than $1 trillion, and the state advanced while the private sector receded, state firms even absorbing private airlines. 2 economists who studied 250,000 firms found that state enterprise profits were overstated and would be wiped out at market interest rates. With Western finance in ruins and Europe unable to rescue Greece, the leadership concluded that Marx's prediction of capitalism's collapse had been vindicated, and that its own system was superior, and it began to speak of a China model and a Beijing consensus set against the Washington consensus. Repression intensified. Liu Xiaobo was arrested for the Pro-Democracy Manifesto, Charter 08, inspired by the Czech Charter 77, and sentenced to 11 years. He later won the Nobel Peace Prize, and a Chinese official warned that those who challenged China would bear the consequences. The artist Ai Weiwei, co-designer of the Bird's Nest Stadium, published his own tally of the children killed in the earthquake, was beaten by police, had his studio bulldozed, and was detained for 3 months. The state expanded its Great Firewall, blocking Google, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, advertised for 10,000 censors, and, fearing an online call for a jasmine revolution during the Arab Spring of 2011, banned even the sale of jasmine flowers, and met protesters with tens of thousands of police. Public security spending reached some $77 billion in 2010, cities were wired with millions of surveillance cameras, and after ethnic clashes in Urumqi, the region was blanketed with them. Abroad, China poured billions into soft power, opening more than 280 Confucius Institutes in 80 countries, and expanding its state media, while writers produced tracts arguing, in one author's words, that China had the capacity to learn from the West, but the West lacked the capacity to learn from China. Its military budget climbed from around $20 billion in 2001 toward $90 billion in 2011, figures the author suggests were understated by a third to a half. The Navy grew to some 260 vessels, and the first aircraft carrier, a refurbished Soviet hull, began sea trials. The foreign minister Yang Jiechi told China's smaller neighbors, "China is a big country and other countries are small countries, and that's just a fact." The chapter ends with the rise of Xi Jinping, a princeling and son of a revolutionary elder, close to the military, whose chief political skill, Dikötter dryly notes, was an ability to say or do little of any consequence, and with a hardening posture in the South China Sea, where weeks after Xi took office, Hainan authorized the boarding of ships in contested waters, in what the author calls the harbinger of a more rigid hand to come. The turn toward the state was explicit. Hu Jintao favored a policy summed up as the state advances and the private sector recedes, and between 2000 and 2010, state enterprise profits rose sevenfold, even as independent studies suggested they were illusory. At Davos in early 2009, Wen Jiabao blamed the crisis on the blind pursuit of profit and the failure of financial supervision in the West, and officials claimed their own response had proved the superiority of the Chinese system. Charter 08, the manifesto that cost Liu Xiaobo his freedom, had been modeled on the Czech dissidents, Charter 77, and signed at first by some 300 people. The soft power drive that accompanied all this had begun modestly, the first Confucius Institute opening in Uzbekistan in 2004, and the first in America at the University of Maryland, before the network spread to 80 countries within a few years. Epilogue. The Epilogue argues that after 2012, China's debt-driven growth model reached a structural dead end, even as Xi Jinping concentrated unprecedented personal power and pursued a foreign policy that alienated the very United States-led order on which China's rise had depended. Local governments, having kept building after the stimulus was scaled back, evaded borrowing limits by creating more than 10,000 off-the-books financing vehicles, so that by the time Xi formally took over in November 2012, local government debt stood at roughly $3 trillion, about equal to the country's entire foreign reserves. The whole system, Dikötter argues, rested on a land collateral trap in which local governments sold land, banks overvalued it, and yet more land was sold to roll over the debt. By 2010, about half of local government income came from land transfers. When the National Audit Office was sent to tally the debt, one economist estimated it had doubled in 2 years, and by some counts, the national total approached 200% of output. A stock bubble encouraged by the government nearly tripled prices before crashing in July 2015, whereupon the state ordered brokerages to buy some $19 billion of shares, outlawed selling, and blamed hostile foreign forces. One economist remarked that the regime had destroyed its stock market in order to save it. A capital exodus of nearly $1 trillion followed a currency devaluation, and the foreign optimists, the author notes, finally fell silent. Xi's anti-corruption drive, led by Wang Qishan, brought down more than 100 senior figures, most spectacularly Bo Xilai, whose fall came after his police chief sought asylum at an American consulate and exposed the murder of a British businessman. Unlike his predecessors, Xi made the campaign permanent and later turned it on the business community, and billionaires began to disappear. He chaired 11 leading groups, more than any leader since Mao, earning the label Chairman of Everything and a set of grand titles, and in 2018, the abolition of presidential term limits made him, in effect, chairman for life, complete with a reviving cult of personality and compulsory study of his thoughts by schoolchildren. Repression widened into what the author calls the worst crackdown in decades, driven by the conviction that hostile foreign forces led by the United States were conspiring against the party. In 1 year, the People's Daily ran dozens of articles blaming the country's ills on Western and foreign forces. Foreign correspondents were treated as spies, and a record number were expelled. Books from Orwell's works to Winnie the Pooh were banned, and by the end of the decade, China and the West had, in effect, 2 separate internets. At the borders, the hand grew heavier still. After Uyghur militants killed dozens at a railway station, Xi demanded that the organs of dictatorship be used without mercy, and more than 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslims were confined in re-education camps. In Hong Kong, the Occupy movement of 2014 and the vast extradition bill protests of 2019 were answered by a national security law imposed on the 30th of June 2020, which crushed the democratic opposition and prompted foreign sanctions and the end of the territory's special trading status. An assertive foreign policy pressed disputes with almost every neighbor, and American tariffs from 2018, together with the coronavirus that emerged from Wuhan, entrenched Western distrust until the American Secretary of State announced that the era of engagement with China was over. Dikötter argues that Beijing's belief in American hostility had become a self-fulfilling prophecy, its wolf warrior diplomacy alienating India, Japan, Australia, and Europe alike, and even reviving NATO's sense of purpose. The deeper problem, he concludes, was economic. Between 2010 and 2020, growth doubled, but debt trebled to 280% of output, and consumption could not rise because wealth flowed to the state rather than to the people, 600 million of whom, Li Keqiang admitted, lived on about $140 a month. Demographically, the working population had begun to shrink, the legacy of the one-child policy. The old easy options, foreign capital, cheap labor, land sales, subsidized exports, and endless borrowing, were all exhausted. The party faced the task of fixing structural problems of its own making without surrendering its monopoly on power, and that, in the author's final words, seemed very much like a dead end. The hidden debt, when auditors finally looked, proved to be layered and opaque, part in direct bank lending, part in shadow lending, part in unpaid IOUs, and the government itself later estimated that some $6.8 trillion had been squandered since 2009 on ineffective investment on steel mills and empty stadiums. The costs abroad compounded the costs at home. What came to be called wolf warrior diplomacy alienated India, Japan, Australia, and Europe, and even revived NATO's sense of purpose, its Secretary-General warning of a country that did not share the alliance's values. Yet the gravest constraints were internal and demographic. The rural workforce had among the lowest levels of schooling of any comparable economy, with only about 1 child in 3 attending high school, and the risk expert Peter Humphrey, arrested and made to confess on television, became a small emblem of a country turning inward. The party's dilemma, Dikötter concludes, was that every remaining path to reform ran through the one thing it would not surrender, its monopoly on power. This concludes the summary of China after Mao, the rise of a superpower. Across 4 decades and 10 chapters, Frank Dikötter presses one argument above all others, that China's rise, though real, was neither a market miracle nor a step toward political freedom. The party retained ownership of the economy's commanding heights and its own monopoly on power throughout, using the tools of capitalism while keeping them, as he puts it, firmly in socialist hands, and leaving the superpower it built resting on foundations of debt, waste, and repression.